You a Game Boy guy, Kelly?
Partially.
So wait, what does that mean? Are you Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance? I know we're both
Okay,
Virtual
so
Boy guys.
now that you've given me the question more clearly, Game Boy Color guy.
Game Boy Color, interesting. Game Boy Color is the one I kind of missed the boat on. I went straight from Game Boy to Game Boy Advance, and then I kind of backtracked into some cool Game Boy Color games that I played on my Game Boy Advance. But we can get all into that more. This is Bog Panda. I am Dr. Mike at Official Pagan on everything, and joining me, of course, as always.
Hi, everybody. This is Kelly at KELLYTHUL on Twitter and Instagram. We really greatly appreciate it if you'd consider subscribing to the Bog Panda YouTube channel. Hit that bell button so you know when new stuff comes out. While you're there, a few comments or likes are always appreciated. And then mosey on over to the merchandise now that we've got a t-shirt shop that doesn't deny us every time we try and put a new shirt out. We got some fun stuff out there. You should really take a look, and we're updating it all the time. And of course, the Bog Panda YouTube channel is the home of Hard No, the world's shortest podcast, and that alone should be worth a subscription.
Absolutely. That is worth the totally free cost of admission for this.
Yes.
So we're going to talk a little bit about Game Boy games, particularly late in the NES life. There were a lot of games where the Game Boy counterparts and the Nintendo versions, the NES versions, were very, very similar to the point where it seems like it's the same core game with just some minor cosmetic differences between them. There's a video about that that I come across and shared with Kelly. This is definitely true. There was some of this going on. Not so much in the earlier days of the Game Boy, but as they really learned how to program for the Game Boy and the games got a lot more impressive as they went along, that sort of dovetails with them caring less and less about what was coming out on the NES because they were shifting their focus towards the Super Nintendo. So it's easy to see how these things kind of started to bleed together.
Yeah, it is, and when you actually see, and we're going to include a link in the description to the video that Mike came across. Um, when you see them side by side, it couldn't be more obvious. But I think anyone who's familiar with the systems and played the games would have also sussed that out pretty quickly. But it was very much just a colorization of grayscale Nintendo Game Boy games into the NES, and with, as Mike mentioned, some minor improvements, maybe a new sprite or two. Obviously, a wider field of vision than the square screen of the Game Boy, so you get that. But it was interesting when they kind of ran through the list. A lot of Disney stuff made its way across both, and then I guess, and we've talked about it a little bit before, a lot of that there are a lot of um, movie tie-in games out there. I really didn't recognize how deep and far that ran until I found out there's a cliffhanger game. Uh,
Oh, you just found out about the cliffhanger
I
game?
just
Sorry.
found out about the cliffhanger game. So I didn't know it existed, and now I hear it's multi-platform, so sorta, and so it looks it looks interesting.
Yeah, Cliffhanger was out for just about every platform at that time. So there's a whole weird there are tons of movie license titles, and this would definitely be something I would love to delve into deeper, looking at some of those titles. But there's a really weird space of Sylvester Stallone starring games of movie tie-in games with him. Because not all movie tie-in games are bad. I think that reputation comes from, though, the fact that most of them are slapped together and rushed out to tie into the movie to make sure that they're coming out in the right time frame. So unfortunately, they are seldom given the proper development time that they need. But the Sylvester Stallone ones are especially odd, I would say, some of those. Cliffhanger, I remember at the time getting almost universally panned. This isn't like one of those games where, years later, there's this kind of different focus on it, like Shaq Fu. which
Right.
we kind of talked about. Shaq Fu may not be the greatest game of all time, but at the time, nobody hated that game. It wasn't, people talking about what an insane thing this was, the way that people do now. That's more of a thing that's come up on the internet from people who are looking back on it now. Like, this is such an odd and bizarre game that was made at that time of a NBA star with his own fighting game. At the time, though, nobody really thought anything odd of it. And a lot of sports stars started appearing in games that weren't necessarily tied to their sport, because it's a lot cheaper to just pay them for their likeness than to pay all of the NBA to get all of the teams and players in there. So there's a Michael Jordan platforming game for anybody who's interested. But yeah, Cliffhanger was a particularly interesting one. This really makes sense to me because of the way that the trajectory of those systems was going. End stage games for systems are one of the most interesting things to me, especially in the retro gaming, because you have games that they clearly don't care about and just rushed out the door to keep some sort of product moving forward. But then you have probably some of the best games in a tech demo sense that usually come out at the end of a system's life because they've figured out all of the programming tricks. They're hard to learn for it. So even with the NES, like late in the NES's life, you had the Kirby game, which I didn't like as a game, but looks amazing.
Yeah.
And is incredible that that's running on an original NES. And I think it's 4 megs, which is like 8,000 times bigger than every other NES game that was coming out at that time, which was the size of a Word document, most of them. So, the fact that it was a 4 meg game on an NES was insane. There were early Genesis and Super Nintendo games that were 4 megs.
Yeah, it is an interesting time to, particularly when it's just so like the NES, I think, is one of the best examples of it. It was the company is going to continue on. They're coming out with a updated version or a new platform for folks to go to. But it's not like the wheels are coming off completely, where other ones end of life. So end of life for like the Atari Jaguar, was a different kind of thing, end of life for NES. End of life as you kind of get into Saturn and some of those. I mean, things are when I said everything, if you're in a death spiral, less interesting and more garbage. But with something like the NES, where actually, the success was only getting greater and greater for Nintendo. It is interesting to see that sometimes they'll get some interesting things at the end of it. What's not particularly interesting is Game Boy games, just with throwing some colors on them and say, boom, new game, here you go. The examples that were provided in the video that we were talking about, like Paperboy, Aladdin. Although the Aladdin gameplay, I've always thought kind of the Aladdin game was pretty decent overall. It's on my Legends Ultimate. That's probably my preferred platform to play it on, because I've got kind of the arcade-like controls for it. But I think a pretty reasonable adaptation. Obviously, they didn't do a ton, so what it meant was it was a really good Game Boy game that they're able to kind of eke out over to NES.
Yeah, and honestly, I'm surprised there wasn't more of this on Nintendo. So Sega was a big fan of doing this. So Sega had their own 8-bit system, which was the Master System, which actually predates the NES. People forget, because of how long the lifespan of the Genesis was. The Genesis wasn't in competition with Super Nintendo, it was in competition with the NES. Genesis came out at the time NES came out. So that's how far ahead Sega was. So you have a, Genesis Mini, and you remember what the Nintendo games looked like, the NES games. That was their competitors. I mean, Genesis was light years ahead of them, but they still had the Master System, their 8-bit system, which particularly in Brazil, as we had talked about before with Tectoy and things like that, was still going very strong. So when they came out with their own handheld, which was Game Gear, it was 8-bit the same way Master System was, similar to Game Boy was 8-bit, just like NES, obviously underpowered compared to that, but it was still running off an 8-bit processor. So Sega realized very early on that they could just easily convert Master System games to the Game Gear and vice versa. So they did a lot of that early on, whereas I think Nintendo didn't really get onto that bandwagon until later, apparently.
Yep. Yeah, but it's kind of interesting to watch the kind of circle of life.
Yeah.
Lion King game too. Another game I went to.
Another one.
Another little tie in there for you, but they kind of see how they cycle through. But I mean, there's nothing wrong with it as long as they don't kind of oversell. This is going to be an amazing new experience for you and all that, and folks get a sense of it. I do think it's slightly more enjoyable to play, although it is interesting because of one of the limitation. I guess it is for the Game Boy, not the Game Boy Color, but the Game Boy. A lot of times, if you had a figure, a character, an item that was all black, and it was coming out of shadows or around those types of things, you had to kind of have this little light gray outline on the outside of the figure to allow at least some level of definition so you could see it and kind of react to it. And that just seemed to carry forward where it was no longer needed or necessary in the NES world. You'd have the necessary contrast for most of it, and really pronounced if you look at the Indiana Jones one, where it's just the Indiana Jones characters seems like, wow, he's got an extra outline around him that seems to serve no purpose in the NES version. And so when you see that legacy come forward, which they had to do for the monochrome stuff in the Game Boy, when that outlining kind of carries forward, that's a little bit of it. Would have been nice for them to trim that off as they ported it, but that'd be work.
Yeah. Why do that? I will say, as I mentioned in the beginning, I was very late to Game Boy Color. I had a Game Boy, big fan of Game Boy throughout the life of that system. Skipped Game Boy Color and ended up being an early adopter of Game Boy Advance, which I'm a huge fan of that as a platform. There was tons of great stuff on Game Boy Advance, a lot of weird games that never appeared on other platforms that I would like to talk about at some point. Really interesting stuff, but Game Boy Advance was backwards compatible, and they were still putting out Game Boy Color games well into Game Boy Advance's life. So as we were talking about, the end of the life cycle of a gaming system, the Game Boy Color games that were coming out, while they didn't match the quality of what Game Boy Advance was doing, I mean, there were Game Boy Advance games that had full motion video and things like that. So it wasn't, and there's Morbius, but it wasn't matching that level of what it could do. But it was really impressive stuff. And one of my favorite Resident Evil games came out at the end of the Game Boy Color life, which was Resident Evil Gaiden for Game Boy Color. I picked that up, played it on my Game Boy Advance, of course, but I remember buying a physical copy of that, and I still play that game. That's a really fun game.
Cool. Yep, we should definitely kind of dig into that catalog sometime. So, like to hear your folks' thought in terms of fair play here to kind of do that, or is it kind of a cheap move? What do you think about kind of end of cycle for systems? Was there any things that happened with you as you're going forward, as you started to get towards the end of the cycle of a system where you came across this kind of treasure or cool game? We'd love to hear about it. Let us know in the comments.
Bog Panda.